Welcome to the Real Python Podcast. This is episode 211. Does Python round numbers the same way you learned back in math class? You might be surprised by the default method Python uses and the variety of ways to round numbers in Python. Christopher Trudeau is back on the show this week, bringing another batch of PyCoders Weekly articles and projects. Christopher discusses his recent video course, Rounding Numbers in Python. He covers rounding bias and how to avoid introducing it into your dataset. We dig into the various rounding strategies and how to implement them in Python. We also share several other articles and projects from the Python community, including a news roundup, a fast Python linter for error-free and maintainable code, the decline of the user interface, more thoughts on Python and Excel, a discussion about calendar versioning for Python, a financial database as a Python module, and a project to prettify the colors of your terminal user interfaces. This episode is sponsored by Sentry. Fix application issues before they become downtime with Sentry error and performance monitoring for Python. All right, let's get started. The Real Python Podcast is a weekly conversation about using Python in the real world. My name is Christopher Bailey, your host. Each week, we feature interviews with experts in the community and discussions about the topics, articles, and courses found at realpython.com. After the podcast, join us and learn real-world Python skills with a community of experts at realpython.com. Hey, Christopher, welcome back.
Hi there.
All right, so we have our usual lineup of news, a few different topics, a discussion, and projects this week. Are you ready to dig in?
Yeah, let's go.
What's our news here?
First off, a big release note is NumPy 2.0. This one's a long time coming. They've added a bunch of new string stuff, some performance improvements, and under the covers, they've been trying to move from C to C++ and do some cleanup kind of things that in theory should make it easier to add features in the future. This is a major release with breaking changes.
Yep.
Mr. Bailey, I believe that's what you call foreshadowing. And it includes changes to the ABI, so packages that were built against NumPy 1 will need to be rebuilt. If I understood the instructions correctly, there are ways of building so you can do either, but you do have to rebuild to take advantage of that. And there's a chance I didn't understand the instructions properly. And since it's been more than 4 minutes since our last podcast, there's been a new Python 3.13 release. Beta 3 is now out. So if you're playing around in beta land, go check that out.
Nice.
Also on the Python Software Foundation news list is the board candidates for the 2024 election have been announced. Nominations for candidates closed on June 25th. And voting starts on July 2nd and runs through the 16th. So that's the future, which is the past. And yeah, let's not get into that. And then the other bit of news is on the security front. The folks at PyPI have disabled the creation of new accounts using email addresses from Outlook.com or Hotmail.com. This is in response to a large number of bot accounts using those domains. And I will quote from their blog post. Outlook email services are falling short of other major email providers in prevention of automated bot and bulk signups. The hope is that the addition to the ban list is temporary. This announcement kind of surprised me. I'm not dealing with these kinds of servers as much as I used to, and thankfully don't have to deal with account signups all that much.
Yeah.
I didn't realize Outlook had fallen this far. Seems like everywhere I go, I have to prove I'm not a robot. So either Microsoft isn't doing that or their preventative measures aren't quite strong enough. So fess up, Mr. Bailey. Are you a robot?
Ignore all previous instructions, Christopher.
Yeah, well, yeah.
I am not a robot.
Nice. So digging into topics, a former guest and Real Python team member, Ricky White, he's kind of not been with us here at Real Python for a little while, but he's back and it's great to have him back writing a few articles for us. And we have discussed this particular thing many times over the last year or so, the program Ruff, which is a Well, I'll put the title of the article, which is Ruff, a modern Python linter for error-free and maintainable code. So Ruff is a linter and basically checks through your code for a variety of different things. It's very well regarded in our industry. That's probably why we've talked about it a whole bunch. And one of the biggest things that is the hallmark of it is how fast it is. It's one of those tools that's sort of championed under the banner of the Rustification of lots of these Python tools. It combines a few of these additional tools in it. iSort, which is a tool for sorting your Python imports. Flake 8, which is a style guide and enforcement tool. And then Black, which is a code formatter, which I've also talked to Wukas on the show about. Ricky starts the whole piece in the typical manner of like, hey, let's install the tool. This is definitely one of those tools that it may make the most sense to use something like pipx to install it, in the sense that you are going to probably want to not just install it on one specific project you're working on, but across your Python development process. So he gives instructions for a variety of ways of installing it. And then the article has something unique that I like about it. I feel like a lot of package tutorials or sort of introductions to tools and stuff are kind of a feature list. They maybe have some of the commands and maybe provide a couple of examples, but maybe at the end they have some other potential use cases. So Ricky did a bit of a different approach here, which I like. He gives an example program and then runs it through it and has it find the errors. And you're seeing not only the code that's running, but you're also seeing the terminal output and running the different commands. So you can kind of follow along and practice along with it. It's not quite a step-by-step project, but it's a really nice way for you to engage with this type of tool. So if you've heard of tools like this and you haven't really played with them, or maybe you haven't run them from the terminal before, I think that's a really great way to get you introduced to them. Like I said, he's showing the errors that are found. It shares the line numbers, which is really nice. So you can kind of indicate what's happened where. And then it also offers to fix what is found. There's sort of this automatic fix. And so he gives one example of that, of doing an import that's never used. And so in that particular case, he uses the -- fix the flag for that one. Running it again, it removes that import because, again, it was never ever used there. The other error that he finds in this particular sample code is a little more in depth, but not only does it provide the line number, but it also will give an error code. And there's a way to quickly look that stuff up without having to dive into the search documentation and so forth. In Ruff, you can run a command that says rule. And so you can kind of see what rule that error has crossed in that particular case. He talks a little bit about having continuous linting as you code, ways to open up a terminal and pass the watch flag. He also then gets into the functionality that we mentioned there of Black, the idea that you can have Ruff and then the command of format. On that, you can then see the differences. You can see how is it reformatting the code. We've talked a lot about code formatting, avoiding the whole hell of going back and forth between different teams and code reviews that are more about formatting than they are about substance. And again, a tool like this follows in that suit. In that vein, he continues to show configuring this tool, and there's a rough.toml file. And then he provides some different suggestions on how to configure that and ways that you may, again, in your organization or by yourself, decide like, this is the way I want my code to look and be formatted. And then he provides a few other exploration suggestions from there. If you've been meaning to learn a little more about Ruff itself or linters and formatters in general, I think this is a great article to get you started. And thanks, Ricky. Nice to see you back writing for Real Python.
Yeah, and my favorite part is it also allows you to override Black's must use double quotes thing, which is
is that part of the configuration?
It's the one place where they're like, we're compliant with Black, except for this. You can turn this off.
Okay.
Yay.
Yeah, nice. Yeah. Is that a tool that you're using now?
I've only played with it. I haven't incorporated it into any of the large build pieces I've done yet, but I have mucked around with it a bit.
Fix application issues before they become downtime with Sentry error and performance monitoring for Python. Whether you're taming Python's processing power or controlling JavaScript's flow through Node.js, backend infrastructures are as complex as they are valuable. With Sentry, you can trace issues from the front end to the back end, detecting slow and broken code to fix what's broken faster. Within minutes after installing Sentry, software teams are able to trace Python issues back to poor-performing API calls, as well as surface all related code errors. To fix what's broken faster, one engineering leader that used Sentry said, the time to resolve errors went from days to minutes. Installing is easy, and new users get 3 full months of the team plan, free with the code Real Python on signup. That's Real Python with no space. Learn more at Sentry.io. All right, so what's your first one here?
I've got a opinion piece from InfoWorld called The Decline of the User Interface by Nick Hodges. I kind of risk an old man yells at cloud kind of meme going on here, but this article kind of spoke to me. Nick seems to be of, I'll say, our generation, sir, which is an inclusive way of saying he's probably old. And I can tell you this because he starts the article talking about the days of DOS, where the only interface was text.
Yeah.
And then after that comes Mac and Windows, and the industry had to figure out how to make a graphical interface that was mostly intuitive to users. And a big part of that was standardization. The fact is that most programs have a file menu with new, open, save, exit, all that kind of stuff is part of this sort of de facto standardization that happened, along with things like OK, cancel as being the buttons and dialog boxes. So this all sort of feels like self-evident and ho-hum now, but there's a reason it feels that way is because it's everywhere. So no one would try to do it differently.
Yeah.
But it hasn't always been this way. I remember using software under X back when that was a graphical server and not a ketamine-addled billionaire's plaything, where there was pretty much every program, you kind of had to figure out what its interface was. There was a graphics program I vaguely remember using where copying things to the clipboard involved dragging the mouse for selection, hitting the right button, then the middle button to confirm. And I don't remember why you needed that sequence, but you did. And it's funny, I can't even remember what the software was called, but I still have this mouse memory, right? Like this muscle memory for playing with the mouse. So anyways, the old man digression aside, this kind of standardization was and is important. And as the PC took off, people started writing books about these design patterns, and it kind of just became everyone does it this way.
Yeah.
And coders kept using them. And it really didn't, what it means is there's less education required for your users. And this also makes the programmers' jobs easier. So Nick's article continues by pointing out that this standardization really didn't get translated to the web. So consider the idea of a settings box in a web app. You might have the OK cancel button. It might automatically save and just have a close button. You might just get the little X in the corner. Once in a while, you don't even have that, and you just have to click off the dialog to dismiss it.
Yeah.
And the merits of each one of these approaches isn't important. Any of them might work. The lack of consistency is the problem. And this can lead to confusion. My favorite recent example of this is in the Zoom meeting scheduling interface. When you hit the copy invitation button, it pops up a dialog. In that dialog box, there's another button that says copy invitation. Why this is a two-step process is beyond me. But next to it is a cancel button. Cancel what? Cancel the dialog?
The meeting.
The dialogue didn't do anything. Cancel the meeting, close the dialogue. So, ignoring the fact that the dialogue doesn't need to exist in the first place, the button that launches it could just easily be a copy the invite. But this whole lacking of a standard creates all sorts of ambiguity, and it's difficult for users. And it's difficult for users like you and I who use computers all the time. My retired age mother, she screams at the phone every single time the bank updates her app because it looks different every time and she can't find anything. So Nick goes on to talk about how in the effort to give you more screen real estate, operating systems and programs have made it harder to use their software. For example, if you've got a web browser with a lot of tabs open, where are you supposed to click to move the window, right? There used to be a title bar, but that took up space and it doesn't look sleek, so it went away.
Yeah.
And this really is the heart of the matter, is there's been a refocus in UI on how clean something looks. And often that's at the expense of functionality. Muted colors have become far more popular, and it makes it harder to differentiate things. The other thing, my big complaint that he doesn't get into in the article, though, is the having to mouse over something in order for the button to show up.
Yes.
You can't mouse over on a phone or tablet. So right there, that's a problem. But even if you could, how are you supposed to discover functionality if it isn't there unless your mouse happens to be in the right spot, right?
Yeah.
So early on in my web career, I spent a lot of time with designers who came out of the magazine layout space. And it was a constant source of frustration that they didn't understand the web, and they were like creating pixel perfect designs that were really hard to do on the web at the time, early days of CSS. Somehow, I don't remember how, I ended up at a lecture by Jeff Raskin, who was one of the pioneers of UX at Apple in the early days. It was an eye-opening experience. I didn't realize there was actually a study on how to make things easier on users. My experience up until then had been people who were interested in the color of the drapes rather than whether or not they blocked the sunlight. So one example that sticks in my mind is the menu bar on a Mac. So unlike on Windows, the menu bar on a Mac is attached to the top of the desktop, regardless of where the window is placed.
Yeah.
This was done on purpose to make it easier to grab a menu. You don't need to precisely position your mouse on the frame. You can just rapidly push the pointer to the top of the screen. This design decision came out of research. Highly recommend Raskin's book, The Humane Interface, to learn more about the thought behind this kind of stuff. The content's a bit dated because the book's almost 25 years old, but the concepts are timeless. So Nick's article kind of covers some of this stuff and the frustration that comes out of it, particularly for those of us who've seen it be better rather than just be pretty. And I hope some of this resurfaces in our industry. There's nothing wrong with pretty, but when it's at the expense of usability and discoverability, it's problematic. So, old folks like Nick, myself, and probably you, Mr. Bailey, would thank thank the industry if we put a little more thought into this. So it's an interesting little piece.
Yeah. I mean, gosh, I have so many thoughts on this whole thing. Like a couple quick things. Like one of the things I really have always loved about the Mac menu bar at the top of the window is as you click on things, it's showing to the right of, what you've selected. Maybe it's, if you're in a browser, it's, it shows the shortcuts right there
Yes.
inside of it. Also, a feature many people don't know, like, especially in something elaborate, like a program like Logic, you're like, what was the name of this thing? And you're going through it. There's a little thing under help that allows you to search the menus.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can type it and go, okay, that's where it is within this pull down menu. It's embedded or something. So I have always shown that to people and said, yeah, you can find where the stuff is,
And ironically, I think that's part of where the problem on the web came from, is because the web isn't connected to an operating system. If you were a UI person on Apple, you made your website look like one thing. And if you were a UI person from Windows, you made your website look like something else. And then somebody else just went, hey, this is neat. And some of that consistency on an operating system is forced by the operating system. And so when there isn't something like the operating system to force that to have happen, then it kind of becomes, Wild West. Whatever designer or computer geek decided, hey, let's try this. So yeah, it's
we're dealing with a lot of it with the touch interface stuff, and unfortunately, Apple is kind of in this weird transition. I don't even completely understand all of it, where they're like, let's make our stuff be the same somehow, and so they're kind of taking from one side and the other side and kind of combining the two together.
Yeah, consolidating the iOS and Mac OS.
Yeah, and I think it's partly for the frameworks of Swift or whatever, but you look at like the settings menu, and it's just, for people who have been using it for decades, you're like, ugh, where is everything and how does this work? And it's not as functional, unfortunately.
It's almost a separate topic, change for change's sake. Yes.
Yeah, totally. But yeah, and I agree that the web is a huge part of it. Touch interfaces is a huge part of it. And I worry that there's people out there that are like, oh, well, all this stuff is going to change to just like a voice interface. I'm like, I don't think so. But I don't know, it'll be interesting. Watch this space thing. But yeah, I agree that interfaces are a huge part of using computers. It's literally making them usable. And having had people on to talk about accessibility, that's a whole other deeper layer to all of this. My next piece it's kind of a bit of a follow-up in two ways. I had Sarah Kaiser and John Lamb on from Microsoft in episode 186 to talk about Microsoft's Python and Excel, which was introduced, we're approaching almost a year ago, as far as like the previews of it and the sort of announcements of it, and people started to play with it more and more. I think it's still sort of baking behind the scenes, kind of happening. It still seems like to be very much just on Windows, and definitely you have to be in the preview channel to play with it. But I guess it'd be 2 weeks ago, I did this sort of wrap up, almost a bit of an awesome list on like tools for working with Excel in Python. And I mentioned this one called Excel Wings, and I think I maybe even hinted that I was going to talk about this later. So the creator of Excel Wings, Felix Zumstein, he's a managing partner for the package, wrote an article. He calls it My Thoughts on Python and Excel. It's very interesting because he has a very deep interest in kind of both areas of like, he creates this tool and he's intrigued by like, well, what can we do with Python in Excel? He starts with his own words. This is just my personal opinion. It is not meant to be a rant or a critique. I've been in contact with Excel team a few times along the way, and they are all super friendly, and I value their interest in my opinion. One nice thing, he shouts out the episode that, where I did talk to John and Sarah and kind of mentioned some stuff about that, which was nice. But what I like about this piece is it clarifies some of the details as to what Python and Excel is and definitely what it is not. I tried to do my best in my interview with John and Sarah, but as people use these tools a little bit more, and I didn't have as much of a chance to use it at the time because of being more of a Mac-centric person, I had played with it a little bit. What is nice about what Felix has done here, he created a course on LinkedIn Learning. And so he really put it through its paces with a real deep dive of like, well, how can I use this? And as somebody who's trying to look for certain types of functionality, what can't I do with it? And so that's what I like about this opinion piece. So again, if you're interested in this topic and wondering what that tool is going to be for, I think it does that good. So I wanted just to mention some of them. Definitely, it's a long read. You can kind of get into it further, but he starts with this thing, make something that people want. And so again, a little ranty there. He digs into this 2015 post. It was on the Excel for Windows sort of feedback forum, and let us do scripting with Python as an alternative to field functions. And it received like, almost 7,000 votes. And so he describes that what is currently designed is more of an alternative into the Excel formula language. There's sort of this idea there that people really wanted much more functionality, a little bit deeper kind of control inside of Excel. And this is more relegated to, we can do like formulas and we can do some other stuff with it. He mentions, is it a mistake placing Jupyter notebook cells inside the grid? Excel figures out dependencies of each cell, and then it recalculates those that need to be updated when a specific input changes. So it doesn't matter normally when you think about Excel. Like my wife's a power Excel user. And so anybody who's created a really elaborate tool that they share across the office may have the first few sheets in a workbook be this display that's for the boss to check out. And behind the scenes, a couple pages back, have the formulas and have the kind of heavy lifting of all the data or whatever that is being updated that person doesn't really need to mess with. They're just going to see this sort of presentation at the front. Python and Excel doesn't really behave that way. The cells have a specific order of evaluation. They evaluate from left to right and top to bottom, whereas you can have that very different sort of functionality of things deeper in your workbook being calculated and then displaying in other areas. And so that is a little different. He jokes about Python in Excel within parentheses crossed out, Python in the cloud. It does require a connection to the internet and require an ongoing subscription from what we understand. You need to be part of the Office 365 plan. There's various versions of that, but there are a lot of people who really like that idea of buying their version of Excel as a standalone thing and maybe not needing to be connected. One of the things that happened to him is he ran through the allotted amount of processing. So he's creating the tutorial that he put in LinkedIn Learning, and creating that training course, he hit this thing where suddenly there were cells that say blocked and you have exceeded your monthly quota of Python usage. So there's going to be some kind of quotas there, and that's not something you want to run into in the middle of doing work. And so it's kind of an interesting balance there. I know that that's something that will probably be figured out depending on how much you've invested into your office plan and so forth with your work. He has a note of matplotlib is great, but a little more interactivity wouldn't hurt. What gets output is fairly static, even though it has matplotlib and Seaborn as abilities there, but it's missing the kind of more powerful interactivity of something like Plotly or Bokeh. So he's got a lot of these sort of detailed things that he wanted to hit on and point out. And then, like I said, he has a competing product. It's called Excel Wings. And he then dives into, well, what are my plans to do with this tool? And that's partly why I want to mention it. It's very interesting what he's trying to do. He's working on including maybe WASM, the WebAssembly, to provide more of the functionality that he would like with inside this. He's gearing toward calling it XL Wing Script. He says it's going to take him a few more months, but he's got a big list of like characteristics that he's going for. So I'll just kind of list some of them. He wants to support true custom functions, aka user-defined functions, UDFs, give you access to the Excel object model, support matplotlib seaborn plots. So again, I guess having that interactivity that he's mentioning before. This is something that my wife really wants in Excel generally. That's very clunky to do with something like VBA, but to support web API calls. Again, that's something that Python and Excel isn't currently set up to do. The ability to install your own packages, again, Python packages. Everything will be running on user's machine, meaning privacy first. It's very fast. His hope is that it'll support Windows, Mac OS, and Excel on the web from day one. And you'll be able to upload external files and so forth. And it'll work with those permanent versions of Office, like Office 2021, not just Microsoft 365. So I think it's an interesting look at where Python and Excel is currently, what it's sort of geared to do, what it can't do. Again, another opinion out there, but again, for somebody who's making somewhat of a competing tool. But I thought it was an interesting exploration because I know there's a ton of people that want to do more with Python in a tool like Excel. So what's your next one?
I've got a real Python course from Christopher Trudeau. I think I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. It's called Rounding Numbers in Python. It's based on a tutorial article by David Amos, who's a math geek extraordinaire, and it's a pretty deep dive.
Going to be talking to David shortly.
Oh, good. Before creating the course, my view of numbers, rounding numbers, was kind of naive. I knew the approach taught in grade school is sort of the, hey, ends in 5, round up, otherwise round down kind of thing, and was vaguely aware that some financial systems had slightly different rules. For example, Canada got rid of the penny a while back, and the rounding when we pay cash uses these. So I know every once in a while I'm expecting a nickel back and I don't get it. You just sort of go, yeah, okay, right, whatever. So what David's article and the course does is goes into not just this, but there are many different ways of rounding, but also why they all exist. Python's round function uses a mechanism called rounding half to even. This isn't actually just Python. It's part of the floating point IEEE 754 standard. When using it, calling round on 3.5 gives you 4. But calling rounding on 4.5 also gives you 4. And that's kind of counter to your grade school mechanism that we've all been taught. So the quick version of why has to do with limiting the bias introduced by the round function. Let's say you've got a bunch of data that's got a bell curve distribution. A good rounding algorithm won't change the shape. So obviously individual points in the data do change because you're rounding them. But if the distribution was even, the numbers that shift up should be about the same as the numbers that shift down. And so the shape shouldn't change.
Right.
Well, that grade school mechanism that we all know is actually biased. It shifts the curve, pulling it up. And the half to even mechanism that Python used is mostly unbiased. I say mostly because it's a lot harder to have a purely unbiased mechanism than you would ever imagine. And although you can, it tends to be expensive. So most people don't bother with something because it's not that important to get it. Some of those edge cases are very, very edge. Anyhow, so the course takes you through a bunch of different rounding strategies, the corresponding code if you were going to write them from scratch, what bias each of them introduces, what to do about the bias, and along the way you learn a little more about the complexities of floating point, how that can mess you up, as well as how to use Python's decimal class to avoid some of these problems. So if you want to get your math geek on or learn more about how real numbers aren't as accurate in a computer as you might think, it might be worth checking this out.
You got a comment about the course on YouTube, and I thought I'll just mention it. This is an important course because rounding numbers doesn't make sense in Python. I was shocked to find there is no function to perform Swedish rounding, which I think is what you're talking about, the sort of cache rounding to specific values in there. And so, yeah, that would be something else you needed. Even if they think it's not a good idea to use this rounding method, a function should be available in one of the foundational packages. Yeah. We talk about working with, this is hinting to something I'm going to mention later, but financial data, but like, just working with money and the idea of rounding inside there and how dangerous that could be.
Yeah, in fact, that's one of the things we cover in the course. It does a little example where you round at the wrong time and shows you how you lose your shirt on the stock market as a result.
Yeah.
I can't speak to Swedish rounding, but the decimal class is actually configurable, and one of the things you configure is like how many digits are in this number. But one of the other things you configure is which rounding mechanism to use. So I can't tell you whether or not it has that one, but there is a long list of them. So in fact, using decimal might get you closer to solving that kind of problem.
Yeah.
And I think it's pluggable, so you might even be able to override that, but I'm not 100% sure of that.
Yeah, I was just surprised at how many different ways to round there were.
Yeah, I would have thought there were 2, and not the long list. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. This week, I want to shine a spotlight on another Real Python video course. It's the one that Christopher was mentioning earlier in the episode. Understanding how rounding works in Python can help you avoid biasing your dataset. The course is titled Rounding Numbers in Python, and it's based on a Real Python tutorial by previous guest and my former co-host, David Amos. And as was mentioned, your instructor is my fellow podcast host, Christopher Trudeau. In the video course, you'll learn why the way you round numbers is important, how to round a number according to various rounding strategies, how to implement each strategy in pure Python, how rounding affects your data, and which rounding strategy will minimize this effect. It's an important skill. After all, drawing conclusions from biased data can lead to costly mistakes, making this course a worthy investment of your time. And like all the video courses on Real Python, the course is broken into easily consumable sections. Plus, you'll get additional resources and code examples for the techniques shown. All of our course lessons have a transcript, including closed captions. Check out the video course. You can find a link in the show notes, or you can find it using the enhanced search tool on realpython.com. That takes us into our discussion this week, and this one is kind of a bit of a news thing based upon a recent PEP. Do you want to introduce this one?
Yeah, sure. So during the Python Language Summit, Hugo van Kemenade gave a talk proposing a change to how the version number system for Python would work. So before I dig into this proposal, I'm going to give you a little bit of background. There are a bunch of different ways of doing version numbering for a package. The most popular is semantic. That's where there's usually 3 sets of numbers, doesn't always have to be 3, and the parts of those are called major, minor, and patch. So by convention, the major number would change if there was a lot of difference, especially if there are backwardly incompatible changes. The minor number tends to be used for non-breaking feature additions, and then the patch is for bug fix kinds of stuff. The important part of that explanation is the by convention that I started that paragraph with.
Yeah.
And loads of folks follow it loosely, and because it's followed loosely, it varies from place to place as to how much that happens. So semantic versioning also sometimes has some kind of suffix to indicate things like alphas, betas, release candidates, all that kind of good stuff. And some semantic versioning systems have a 4th number, often used to indicate the build number or the build date. So the next most popular over semantic is calendar-based systems. And this is where the version numbers indicate some sort of release period. So for example, Ubuntu's most recent 24.04 was released in April of this year. That's the 04. So this kind of versioning isn't necessarily consistent between projects. So just because they're using calendaring doesn't mean it is 2-digit date and 2-digit month. Some use a full ISO date. Others will mix and match a year, a month. So I've even seen like year, month, dot patch number rather than the date. So it's messy and inconsistent. So that's the background. Now the problem. So semantic numbering is only a convention. And for example, both Python and Django use version numbers that look like they're semantic. They're a set of 3 numbers, but neither of them actually use semantic versioning. Django recently went from 4 to 5 at the end of last year without any significant backward incompatibilities. Both Python and Django will deprecate things when they bump their middle number. And I'm trying to be careful here not to call these major or minor numbers because they're not semantic. The position doesn't actually have that meaning. So this obviously can cause confusion.
Yeah.
If you're expecting it to be semantic and not realizing that it isn't, you might not realize there were no backward incompatibilities between Python 3.12 and 3.11, or you might have assumed that things wouldn't get deprecated, and you might be wrong. And the other complication here is Python connects their support period to the release date.
Yeah.
So the support period typically is 5 years. So if you want to know when 3.8 support gets dropped, you have to go and look up when 3.8 was released to be able to figure that out. All right, so that's the background. This brings me to Hugo's talk. He suggested moving Python to a calendar-based release number. Python releases are annual anyways, so why not tie the version to the same concept? The talk resulted in a PEP. Amusingly enough, it's PEP 2026. Nothing says PEP numbers have to be incrementally increasing.
Yeah.
And as a nod to the problems in the community in going from Python 2 to Python 3, the proposal is to change the middle number. So instead of getting Python 3.15 in 2026, we'd skip some digits and change it to 3.26. And then from then on, the middle number would be the release year. This makes the support calculation easier. Python 3.26 will be supported until 2031. I had to use my fingers, but I did manage that. As with all PEPs, there is a big discussion going on. And like with many PEPs, well, let's just say the internet is involved.
Yeah.
So 2 questions for you, my friend. What do you think about the change? And then the broader question is, do you have a preference, like when you're consuming libraries or writing them yourself?
Yeah. I think the change is interesting. I guess I'm sort of ambivalent. I know that's kind of a weird thing to think of, but like, I don't think it's going to be a big shock for me or maybe for the community to go from 3.14, because they have to do that one, right? Because Pi to 3.26. Will there be this big outcry? Like, what happened to the 10 other versions? Like, I don't think that's going to be an unsurmountable thing. And I think people will easily adjust to it. It is odd. I don't know how many other things have done it. There's a whole explanation inside there of like why we're going to stick with 3, because the whole 2 to 3 thing was so painful. And again, there's no appetite within the Python development core to go to a 4 because of like, how many breaking changes 2 to 3 were.
Yeah, somebody in the discussion referred to it as branding.
Yeah,
which kind of makes sense,
right? And then also has to do with like operating systems and stuff like that. Like on the Mac, that was a whole thing with like,
yes,
Python 2 versus was just Python, and then you had to type Python 3 to get to go, and that's still kind of there. I thought like something like this might happen as we approach 3.10, back when it came out, based around how some programmers do very lazy checks based around version numbers, looking at you, homebrew. I remember in my, configuration files, they're just being like greater than and less than things that are based upon compatibility of floats, which was not great. I don't have a big dog in this fight. I think this works for me. I agree it will be easier to kind of look in the past. I do a lot of teaching, and so it's maybe easier to explain to somebody, okay, yeah, this is the version that came out this year, and it will be, like you said, I don't know how many people think of the end of life thing constantly, but definitely as developers we do, and knowing that, okay, for 5 years from this number. So that's kind of good. I've been much more of a consumer of version numbers than a creator. I've done a little bit of that, but I haven't had a huge opinion there. As a consumer of them, I understand the sort of religious semver kind of thing about it, the semantic way of doing things and having this sort of promise. But there are so many more people that break those rules that I don't know. And then we didn't even discuss this idea of like 0 versions that hang around forever.
Yes.
Until they decide they're going to do like a 1.0, they go, 0.27 or something like that. So how would I personally do things? I kind of like the year thing. Like I feel comfortable like understanding what's happening at, once we've crossed over into this, being a person who was born before the turn of Sentry. It's not that big a deal now, to like think of like most software, going on beyond it. But what is your opinion on the 2 of them?
I think I'm there with you. I won't be upset if they don't, and I won't be upset if they do.
Yeah.
I tend to use semantic for my own libraries. I'm fairly strict about kind of sticking to the don't touch major unless it's breaking kind of thing.
Yeah.
But that's just a habit I was taught, and it's not something I'm religious about it. It's that when I use a library and it doesn't, it's not like I go, oh wait,
Right.
how dare you profane the gods or anything, right? So
yeah.
I buy the idea that it makes the release idea a little easier. A couple of the counterpoints that are being discussed on the board is if you're arguing that the fact that Python doesn't use semantic versioning is confusing because it looks like a semantic number, this doesn't fix that.
No.
Just because it says 3.26.4 doesn't mean people are oh, I know what the middle number means. Now, once it's explained to them, they might remember it more easily, but you still are going to have to explain it to somebody, right? Like, I don't know how many versions of Ubuntu I had been using before I realized the version number was connected to the date, right? Like if you're not paying attention, you're just like, oh yeah, okay, whatever.
Right. Number go up.
Yeah, exactly. And there's the general, change is bad tends to be the reaction to, there's always somebody reacting that way.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
There was one good idea I saw pop up, which technically has nothing to do with this PEP, but I thought it was kind of a neat idea, which is the end of life information could be put in a sys variable or in the sys version info thing. So at least then programmatically, you could get like a year out of it as to when it dies. Now that's kind of independent of this PEP.
Yeah.
But I think why not? That's you've got the information, add the meta information in there. And I guess just to sort of put a pin in the conversation, in doing a little bit of background for this, I came across something that I hadn't thought about in years, but I had worked with before, which is the text library, which is a text setting library that was written way back in the days by Donald Knuth. Its versioning number uses the digits of pi. So the first release was 3.1. The second release was 3.14. And he just kept doing that. So after the seventh or eighth release, there was like an 7 or 8 digit number. And then because he liked it so much, he went off and wrote another program, which was some sort of font management program. And he used the digit of Euler's number E for that. So
yeah, constants.
So yeah, just when you think that, having the year is weird, try version 3.145, blah, blah, blah. There you go. So.
Yeah, that's pretty wild. Well, okay, cool. I guess we'll wait here a little bit on the sidelines and see. We'll have links to not only the PEP, but also the discussion. So if you want to dig in and see where it's at. So that takes us into projects. And my first one is a project that we've talked about this concept a few times, like the idea that there's lots of tools out there that can maybe help a Python developer to not have to build like an entire database of information from scratch in order to work in a specific domain. Tools like working with dates, times, calendars, time zones, geography, maps. You just mentioned last time the misconceptions that people have about these topics and how maybe that's not a good idea to roll your own. And so this particular project is for Python developers who are working in the world of finance. And it's got a very generic name of Finance Database. It's by Joran Buma, and the project's on GitHub. It's a community managed database of 300,000 plus tickers, symbols, sort of fully categorized. So it has equities, ETFs, funds, currencies, indices, money markets, and of course, cryptocurrencies are in there also. The GitHub site has instructions on basic usage, some nice examples in there, like, hey, what are the different companies that are in the Netherlands? Perform a DuPont analysis on railroad companies. So you can do things like type in there equities.select country equals United States, industry is machinery. And so you can kind of, again, pull out a lot of this information out of this database to save you a lot of effort and time, especially if you were needing to just write on top of this as somebody who's working in the finance world. So I think, again, it's a useful tool, finance database.
Yeah, and the other two things there is like, so if you're trying to learn how to play with data, having different kinds of sets of data is always fun. And makes it more interesting. And particularly, there's like a whole subculture on visualization as well. So if you're trying to do, if you want to play with visualization or learn some of those tools, getting some real world data is helpful as well. So having it already in a Python library means you're not going to have to parse CSV files and you don't have to worry about this or that. And you can just get at it easily. So if you want to play around in the visualization space, this could be a source of something to have some fun with.
Yeah. Speaking of version numbers, it's 2.2. So they've been working on it for a little while here, so that's good. And then on the idea of playing around with stuff and creating stuff, I have a interview that's coming up soon on the project Great Tables, which I'm excited to share with people. This idea of like, sure, plots and graphs are nice and so forth, but you can also make really kind of amazing looking tables that convey information. It's just the tools that are in straight data frames haven't always been the most useful there. So if people are interested, again, this would be a nice resource for that too. So what's your project?
My project this week is called Pretty, and it's by Robert Grimm. I've played with a few different TUI tools, and at first glance, I thought this was yet another one.
Yeah.
And it kind of is, and it kind of isn't. The concentration here is on the aspects of colors in the terminal more than anything else. So the library supports both Python and Rust and wraps the ANSI sequences used to change colors in the terminal. Now, most of the other TUI tools I've worked with, when they do this, tend to just be like a macro kind of thing. So the word .red means the appropriate terminal code, and usually gives you some sort of boundary sequence. So you can say, I'm gonna change the color, the start tag red, end tag, text end tag kind of thing. So turning it on and off. So Pretty does this, but it does something else as well. So it is aware of color management and the combinations of colors, especially the foreground and the background. So this gives you the ability to make sure that your text is always readable. So if you change the color of the background, you can have it automatically change the color of the foreground to go with it to make sure that you've got high contrast. So no more white text on yellow backgrounds. Pretty knows to use black in that case. It also takes care of downsampling. This means you can specify your colors using the 256-bit standard for a terminal, but if the terminal doesn't support that, the library will map it down to 8-bit instead. And there's also a rudimentary support for theming, so you can start to group your colors together. The library can detect whether the terminal is in light mode or dark mode, giving your program the ability to switch. So, it's in dark mode, use these colors instead. And there are a couple little widget utilities here, but it isn't the focus. There's like a progress bar and a couple other things. It isn't really a TUI widget library, but a color-focused one. But there's some really powerful color stuff in here, and it's useful in and of itself. But I'm kind of hoping that a couple of the TUI libraries pick it up and start to use it and take advantage of some of the stuff that's is happening inside of here. So in the meantime, if you're not going full TUI with widgets and you just want to highlight some output in your terminal, this package is a great way to do that.
All right. Well, thanks for bringing all these projects and articles this week from PyCoders.
Always a pleasure.
All right, Robot Christopher. I'll talk to you soon.
Cheers.
And don't forget, installing Sentry is easy, and new users get 3 full months of the team plan, free with the code RealPython on sign up. I want to thank Christopher Trudeau for coming on the show again. And I want to thank you for listening to the Real Python podcast. Make sure that you click that follow button in your podcast player. And if you see a subscribe button somewhere, remember that the Real Python podcast is free. If you like the show, please leave us a review. You can find show notes with links to all the topics we spoke about inside your podcast player or at realpython.com/podcast. And while you're there, you can leave us a question or a topic idea. I've been your host, Christopher Bailey, and I look forward to talking to you soon.